إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله أما بعد. So we're continuing talking about the times that ghusl is required, or the times when ghusl is legislated. So whether it's obligatory or recommended, this is what we're going to talk about. So the author, the next thing he says is death. When a Muslim dies, it is obligatory to wash his or her body according to the consensus of the Muslims. And this will be discussed in more detail later on. So meaning he's saying that when we come to the chapters on funeral prayers, it'll be discussed there. But he says there's a consensus. This isn't necessarily correct, because there's two opinions on whether it's obligatory to wash the Muslim after they die or not. So Allahu A'lam, what he means is that it's consensus that the Muslim should be washed, or that from the deen is to wash the Muslim after they die. And the only exception to this is the shaheed or the martyr, as we talked a little bit about before. So the first opinion is that it's obligatory. And that's the opinion of the Ahnâf and the Shâfi'iyyah and the Hanâbilah and some of the Mâlikiyyah. And the evidence that they use is the hadith from Atiyya al-Ansariyyah radiallahu anha, that she said, توفيت إحدى بنات النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم فخرج فقال اغسلنها ثلاثا أو خمسا أو سبعا أو أكثر من ذلك إن رأيتن ذلك بماء وسدر وجعلنا في الآخرة كافورا أو شيئا من كافور. Or that Atiyya radiallahu anha said that the daughter of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or one of the daughters of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, passed away. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam came out and he said, wash her 3 or 5, and some say 7 or more times than that if you see that necessary, with water and sidr. And we talked at length what sidr is before. It's a type of tree. And then he says, the Prophet ﷺ said, and in the last one, place some kafur or a little bit of kafur. And kafur is camphor. It's a type of like a wax substance that's used for smell, to have a nice smell. And this hadith is narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. So the way that this is used, as we talked about before, the Prophet ﷺ commanded it. So if the Prophet ﷺ gives a command, then that thing is obligatory unless we have evidence to say otherwise. And the evidence that it's obligatory is the verse when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَلْيَحْذَرَ الَّذِينَ يُخَالِفُونَ عَنْ أَمْرِهِ أَن تُصِيبُهُمْ فِتْنَةٌ أَوْ يُصِيبُهُمْ عَذَابٌ أَلِيمٌ. Or that let those who go against His command beware in that, or that because they might be stricken by a fitna or be stricken by a painful punishment. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala warned and threatened the person who goes against the command of the Messenger sallallahu alayhi wasallam with a fitna and a painful punishment. So this is the first evidence. The second is the hadith of Abdullah ibn Abbas radiallahu anhuma, that the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wasallam was in Hajj, or a man had died during Hajj, and or the full hadith is بين رجل واقف مع النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم بعرفة إذ وقع عن راحلته فوقصته أو قال فأقعصته دابته فقال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم اغسلوه بماء وسدر. Or that Abdullah ibn Abbas narrated that the Prophet صلى الله عليه وسلم, there was a man standing with him in Arafah, and he fell off of his camel, and it killed him. So the Prophet ﷺ said, wash him with water and sidr. And then the Prophet ﷺ in the full hadith says to wrap him or make his kafan in his 2 pieces of clothing till the end of the hadith. And this is also narrated by Al-Bukhari and Muslim. So here again, the Prophet ﷺ commanded that the person be washed. And then some people say that there's a consensus, and we talked before about consensus as evidence. If the Muslimin have an agreement on a matter, then this is an evidence based upon the Quran and the Sunnah. So some say that there's a consensus on this. And some who mentioned that was Ibn al-Hammam in his book Fath al-Qadir, and An-Nawawî in al-Majmû'. So these are the two evidences. Then also the second opinion is that it's mustahab. So meaning that if a person died, then it wouldn't be obligatory upon the Muslims to wash him, but it would be highly recommended. And that's the opinion of Imâm Mâlik. The argument that they use is they say that yes, the Prophet ﷺ commanded it, but when he said in the first hadith about the Prophet ﷺ's daughter, that when he said to wash her 3 or 5 or more than that, if you see it necessary, they say that when the Prophet ﷺ said, if you see it necessary, it's referring to the whole washing, not necessarily the number. So they say that if it's necessary, wash. If it's not necessary, then you don't have to. So this is the argument that they make. Also they say that if a Muslim is alive and they're in Janâbah, they have to make ghusl for a reason. They have to make wudu for a reason. If a woman finishes her hayd or her nifas, they have to make ghusl for a reason. If a Muslim wants to go to Jum'ah, then it's recommended or obligatory for them to make ghusl to go to Jum'ah. But when the person is dead, there's no more taklif on them. There's no more responsibility when it comes to the ahkam of the sharia, so it's not obligatory. What would be the point? Because there's no ibadah following this, so there's no obligation on that. Then they also argue that because of the number, that this is no longer to remove a najasa, it's no longer to remove a hadath or any sort of thing like, that's similar to janâbah or anything like this, because if it was, then it would be like we talked about at length before. If something is commanded to be washed with a number, or without a number, then we understand from that is that we have to wash it to remove it. Because all we're told is to wash it off. But if the number is involved, then that tells us that the point of it wasn't just to remove something off of the body, because it might take 1, or it might take 15, or it might take 6. So once a number is specified, then it no longer is obligatory to remove something, but it's an act of worship now. It's a ritual act of worship, just like wudu. We're not washing anything off of our body. There's nothing there to wash off, but we're performing an act of worship that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala obligated before the salat. So because of that, we see the numbers in it. So this is the argument that they make. And Allahu A'lam, if we see that, yes, the Prophet ﷺ placed the number with it, but he also commanded it, and so it's a command, so it's obligatory. Also, the fact that the person is dead and is no longer going to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the sense that they need to be upon wudu or they need to remove any sort of hadath. This is irrelevant to us because the Prophet ﷺ didn't command for the dead person to wash himself. He commanded the Muslims to wash him. So we have that duty to this person now. Not that it's obligatory so that they're pure to do something. No, this is our duty towards the dead Muslim as our brother, that they have this right upon the Muslims, so it's obligatory upon us to do so. So Allahu A'lam, the opinion of the majority of the Ahnâf and the Shâfi'iyyah and some of the Mâlikîs and all of the Hanbalîs, this is the strongest opinion. Is there any questions so far? No?
I mean, you're probably going to get into I want to see if you're going to get into this later on. What about the people who were burnt or there's nothing left of their body?
There's a dispute depending on is there more than half or less than half. Is it going to
into it later on or no?
Maybe eventually when we get into like funerals, but for now, just in general, like we're talking about times when a ghusl is obligatory. But as far as like things about like if part of the body's missing, if the part is off, like it's detached from the body, but you still have it, all those types of things. We'll get into that.
What I mean, like if the body's completely burnt, you can't give it a ghusl, you know what I mean?
Yeah, so Allah Alam, like, it would depend on the situation. It would depend on is it actually possible? Was it something where if you do it, it's going to damage the body more? All those things would have to be taken into account. Next thing that the author says is a non-Muslim upon embracing Islam. So talking about the ghusl of when someone enters into Islam, he's saying that this is a time when ghusl is legislated. So he says, new converts to Islam must perform ghusl. And then he mentions, he says the hadith from Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu, أن ثمامة ابن أثال الحنفي أسر فكان النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يعود إليه فيقول, or Abu Hurairah radiallahu anhu narrated that Thumama ibn Athal was taken prisoner by the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ used to visit him, or he used to come and see him. And the full story of the hadith is that when they took him prisoner, they tied him up in the masjid. And he was, so this is, we talked about this before, I forget what chapter it was, but the permissibility, or sorry, we talked about it on whether a non-Muslim is tahir or whether they're najis or not. And this was one of the evidences that was used to show that the non-Muslim is physically tahir in the dunya, physically tahir, because the Prophet ﷺ had him tied up in the masjid as a prisoner. So had he been najis, obviously we know that it's not allowed to bring najasa intentionally into the masjid, like in the hadith from the Bedouin when he urinated in the masjid, and the Prophet ﷺ said to him that these masajid are not, it's not proper to have any filth or najasa or qadr in it. So obviously the Prophet ﷺ wouldn't bring something najis into the masjid. In any case, that's the story behind this hadith. But so the Abu Hurairah mentions that the Prophet ﷺ would visit him. فيقول ما عندك يا ثمامة فيقول إن تقتل ذا دم وإن تمن على شاكر وإن ترد المال تعطي ما شئت. Or that the Prophet ﷺ said, what do you have to say for yourself, O Thumama? So he said, if you kill me, you'll be killing someone of high blood, like meaning that he's a noble person. And if you do a favor for me, then you'll be doing a favor for someone who is grateful. And if you want wealth, then you'll be given whatever you wish. So then the Abu Hurairah continues, he says, فكان أصحاب النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يحبون الفداء ويقولون ما تصنع بقتل هذا فمر به النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم يوما فأسلم فبعث به إلى حائط أبي طلحة فأمره أن يغتسل. Or that the Abu Hurairah says that the Sahaba radiallahu anhum, they wanted to ransom him off, because obviously it would give the Muslims a lot of wealth and it would increase the power of the Muslims. And they used to say, what would be the point of killing someone like this? Like, what would we get out of it? So the Prophet ﷺ passed by him one day, and this person entered into Islam. So the Prophet ﷺ sent him to an area that belonged to Abu Talha, and he told him to make ghusl. فاغتسل وصلى ركعتين فقال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لقد حسن إسلام صاحبكم. Or then he went and he did perform ghusl, and he performed 2 rak'ahs, and then the Prophet ﷺ said, this companion of yours has done well with his Islam. And this hadith, the author says, it's narrated by Ahmad, and he says there's also a source for this story in the hadith of al-Bukhari and Muslim. So, and we'll get into what he means by that, but the point of it is that the story itself is in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. The details in this narration of Imam Ahmad are a little bit different, as we'll see. And we'll get into that right away. So because of these differences in the narrations, there's a number of differences of opinion on whether the person who enters into Islam has to perform ghusl, or whether it's recommended or not. So the first opinion is that it's obligatory. Regardless of what state he was in when he entered into Islam, he has to perform ghusl in and of itself. And that's the opinion of the Mâlikiyyah, or some of the Mâlikiyyah, and it's the Hanbalî opinion. And what they say is here, the Prophet ﷺ, when this Sahabi entered Islam, the Prophet ﷺ commanded him to go perform ghusl. And then this goes back to what we talked about what a command is in the Sharia. It's something that's obligatory unless we have evidence to show otherwise. So they say here, the Prophet ﷺ commanded him, so this is an evidence. They also mention a hadith from Qais ibn Asim, أنه أسلم فأمره النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم أن يغتسل بماء وسدر. Or that Khalifa ibn Hussein narrated from his father, or his grandfather, who was Qais ibn Asim, that he entered Islam and the Prophet ﷺ told him to make ghusl with water and sidr. And we talked about the sidr as well. And then they mentioned some other weak hadith on the topic that we don't need to go into. The second is that it's recommended for him to perform ghusl unless he entered into Islam and there was some reason for him to perform ghusl beforehand. So for example, a man enters into Islam. Before he entered into Islam, he was upon Janâbah. A woman enters into Islam, and before she entered into Islam, she was upon Janâbah, or she just finished her menstruation or her nifas. That at this point, it would be recommended, unless these conditions are present, then it would become obligatory because they have to remove what had happened before. And this is the opinion of the Ahnâf and the Mâlikiyyah and the Shâfi'iyyah. So it's a large number of the scholars say this. What they say is that they say that any najasa that's on the body when the person enters into Islam, it has to be removed. We know that generally the kuffar don't have a problem with najasa on themselves. They don't believe in najasa versus or najis versus tahir or anything like this. So there's going to be a need for them to wash themselves in general. Then they also say that if there's a hadath like menstruation or janâbah or something like this, then it's like the najasa that has to be washed off. If this has to be washed off, then why do we say that they wouldn't have to remove the janâbah or the menstruation? So they say it's the same thing. However, the ones who don't agree with this opinion, they mention the verse that when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, قُلْ لِلَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِن يَنْتَهُوا يُغْفَرْ لَهُمْ مَا قَدْ سَلَفْ, or that to say to the disbelievers or those who have performed kufr, if they cease, then whatever had passed will be forgiven and it will go off of them. And this is from Surah Al-Anfal, verse 38. So they say that the person being upon janâbah before Islam, once they enter into Islam by saying the shahada, everything goes back to the basis or to the default. So there's no janâbah, there's no requirement to perform ghusl from nifas or hayd or anything like this, because Islam wiped out everything that came before it. And that's also because of the hadith from Amr ibn al-As radiallahu anhu, in which the long story is that he came to the Prophet ﷺ and wanted to give bay'ah, so he put out his hand, then he withheld it, and he said, I want to put two conditions on, or put conditions, or a condition. So he said, the condition was that I'll be forgiven. So meaning that I want to have this stipulation, if I enter into Islam, that everything will be forgiven. So the Prophet ﷺ said, أَمَا عَلِمْتَ أَنَّ الْإِسْلَامَ يَهْدِمُ مَا كَانَ قَبْلَهُ, or that don't you know, or haven't you come to know that Islam destroys or wipes out everything that came before it? And that hadith is narrated by Muslim. So this idea that if entering into Islam, you then have to perform ritual acts. So removing najasa is one thing, but to say that now you have to perform something to remove a ritual impurity, like a hadath, like you're upon janâbah or anything like that, this is, Allahu alam, this is not a strong argument. The next opinion is they say that it's recommended. So regardless of whether you were upon janâbah or something like that before, in any case, it's only recommended. It's not obligatory upon anyone to perform ghusl when they enter into Islam. What they say for this is they say, what do we say the default is on anything? If someone says it's obligatory to do this, or it's haram to do this, what's the default with everything?
Everything's haram until proven halal.
What is it?
Everything's haram until proven halal. Everything's halal until proven haram.
Right.
Sorry.
And what about when it comes to obligations?
Everything's tahir except...
No, obligations. Something's wajib.
Everything's obligated until proven not obligated.
Everything's not obligated until proven obligated.
Right. Nothing's obligatory until it's proven.
Oh, okay, yeah.
So if someone comes and says you have to perform wudu before you come in the masjid, you have to be on wudu. What our question would be?
Delete.
What is your proof?
Yeah,
What's the proof? Unless you have something, nothing can be obligatory unless there's evidence. So they say, in this case, this is where we start, and everyone agrees on that. That when we start on the issue, nothing's obligatory. Then they say we have this hadith that the author mentioned, where the Prophet ﷺ commanded the Sahabi or the person after he entered into Islam to go make ghusl. So we have this hadith, but they say it's weak. What's the weakness in it? The author himself alluded to it. So when he said that this story is in Sahih al-Bukhari and Sahih Muslim, the part or the correct narration of the hadith in Bukhari and Muslim is that the Prophet ﷺ didn't tell him to perform ghusl. What happened was, he was in the masjid for 3 days. Then the Prophet ﷺ let him go. Then he left, and he went to, and he performed, he washed himself. Then he came and entered into Islam. So what they say for this is, this authentic narration, that there's no dispute is authentic, doesn't contain that the Prophet ﷺ commanded him to do so. It was an action from this Sahabi himself. Second, according to this narration, he hadn't openly declared his Islam yet. So he hadn't said the Shahada. He did so before. So what's the ruling on an action when it's done by someone who isn't Muslim?
Null and void.
It's null and void. It has no nothing, like
No benefit.
no benefit, right? It might get them rewards when they enter into Islam. If they did a good deed before, they'll get the rewards. But in and of itself, is it a valid action where we would say it fulfilled something? No, it doesn't fulfill anything, because one of the conditions for something to be accepted is that the person is a Muslim. The kuffar, we know that their actions, they're null and void. Like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَقَدِمْنَا إِلَى مَا عَمِلُوا مِنْ عَمَلٍ فَجَعَلْنَاهُ هَبَاءً مَنْثُورًا. We come and deal with what they did, and we make it as if it's nothing, the meaning of the verse. So this shows that, and then there's many evidences to show that obviously a person needs to be a Muslim for his actions to be accepted. So they say we have the default that it's not obligatory. The hadith that's used is weak, and the authentic of it, or the authentic narration of it, just shows that the Sahabi did so on his own. If the Prophet ﷺ does something on his own, he doesn't tell us to do it, he just does it himself. What's the ruling on that action by default?
It's Sunnah.
Sunnah. Is it obligatory? No. So how about if a Sahabi does it then?
It's
Less, obviously less. Either it's nothing, or we say maybe it's recommended depending on the context. So they say that this is the second argument. Then they also mentioned the well-known hadith in Sahih Bukhari and Muslim, the hadith from when the Prophet ﷺ sent Mu'adh to Al-Yaman. So what did the Prophet ﷺ, most people know this hadith, what did the Prophet ﷺ tell Mu'adh radiallahu anhu to teach the people or to call them to? The Tawheed, and then what? If they accept it, and if they accept that, the zakat. He didn't, all these people he was going to call to Islam. We have no evidence that he told them they have to perform ghusl when they enter into Islam. Had it been something that was obligatory, would the Prophet ﷺ have left that out? No. And we know, when did Mu'adh go to Yemen? Was it in the beginning of Islam? Or was it near the end of the Risala? Near the end. So even though maybe someone will say, well, this hadith of the Prophet ﷺ telling him to make ghusl was later on, it's unlikely. And how many Sahaba, what's the estimate of the Sahaba that when the Prophet ﷺ died, how many Sahaba, what's the estimate?
Over 100,000.
Over 100,000. About 110,000. We have nothing of the Prophet ﷺ telling the person, and all these people who entered into Islam, and all the rusul that he sent to the different areas to teach Islam and to call people to Islam and to teach them the ahkam of Islam. We don't have anything where he said they have to perform ghusl. So if we put all of this stuff together, which seems like the most, the opinion that matches the Quran and the Sunnah the most?
It's recommended.
That's recommended. Allahu Alam, this is a stronger opinion. Because if we have nothing that's authentic to command it, and we have all of these other contextual arguments, then this would be the strongest opinion. Allahu Alam. The next issue is the prayer. We talked a little bit about the prayer, meaning that if you're upon janâbah or hayd or mens or nifas, you have to perform ghusl before before being able to pray. So we talked about this at length, and we talked about the wudu even. So we don't need to go into this. Alhamdulillah, we covered it enough. The next thing that the author says after that, though, is tawaf around the Kaaba. So meaning that a person needs to have performed ghusl, so meaning they're not upon janâbah and they're not upon menstruation or nifas before performing tawaf. So during the time they can't be on that on that state. So the author says the reasoning behind this can be found in what actions require wudu as a prerequisite. We talked about the tawaf before, right? So what's the ruling on wudu for tawaf?
You must be on wudu in order to do tawaf.
Okay, do you remember the evidence for that? Any other comments on if you want?
Tawaf is kind of like ibadah, like salah.
Right. Okay. So
in my notes, I can't remember.
So we said that
It was a long time ago we did this.
This is a couple years ago, I think.
You can do tawaf or rak'atayn sunnah. So if you're doing the tawaf, that counts as your sunnah. So it's obligatory for you to.
That's one opinion, yeah. Others say that there's no evidence to say we have to perform wudu beforehand. So again, like we said, if someone comes and says you have to be upon wudu before you enter the masjid, we'd say, what's the evidence? Someone might say, well, because it's like salat, because it's tawaf, and they'll say, like, you guys had mentioned that it's like the tahiyyah for the Masjid al-Haram, and there's also the hadith from Abdullah bin Abbas that we talked about that he said, الطواف من الصلاة غير أنكم تتكلمون فيه, or that the tawaf is from is like the salat, or it is salat, except that you speak during it. So someone might use that too and say, well, see, this shows that it's like the salat. However, when you're performing tawaf, can you eat?
Yes.
Yes. Can you drink?
Yes.
Can you sit down and take a break?
Yes.
Can you turn away from the Kaaba if you have to turn around and look or do something like that? All these differences show really it's not exactly salat. So there is big differences. If you're in the tawaf and for example, maybe Salat al-Maghrib starts, you stop and you pray. So you can break it and you can do different things. So all of these things shows that you don't have to be upon wudu for the tawaf. Plus the hadith that we talked about, that the Prophet ﷺ, he went and he relieved himself and he came back and he started eating. And one of the Sahaba said, you're not upon wudu. Anyone remember what was the reply of the Prophet ﷺ? The Prophet ﷺ said, مَا أَرَدْتُ صَلَاةً فَأَتَوَضَّى. I didn't intend any salat, so I have to make wudu. And that hadith is in Bukhari. And another hadith, it was from Sa'id ibn Mansur, he narrated it. The same hadith, but the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّمَا أُمِرْتُمْ بِالْوُضُوءِ إِلَى الصَّلَاةِ. Or you only have to perform wudu for the salat. So all of these things, they say that, or the stronger opinion, so the Zahiriyyah and Ibn Taymiyyah and others, they say that you don't, and a narration from Imam Ahmad, that you don't have to be upon wudu for the tawaf. So now we come to, what about someone who's upon janâbah? So the reason I said that is because just a recap of all the chapters that we went through before about wudu. So the ones who say you can't be upon janâbah, they say, all the arguments that they say you have to be upon wudu, they also apply it to this. Because if you have to be upon wudu, can you be upon janâbah? No, you can't, because how can you be on wudu? So like, I'm going to go pray now, I made wudu so I can pray, but I'm still on janâbah. Obviously you can't. So one has to be gone before. So all the arguments that are used for wudu, they use it for janâbah. But if we say you don't have to be upon wudu, then this opens up another topic for us now. Because we might say, well, no, you don't have to be upon wudu, but you can't be upon janâbah. So this is another issue to go through. So they mention all of these evidences. We don't need to go through them again. So they mention all of these evidences to show that it's like the salat and to show you have to be upon wudu. And the ones who say you have to be upon, so you have to stay away from janâbah is the opinion of the Mâlikiyyah and the Shâfi'iyyah and the Hanâbilah. And they use all of these things, like so the hadith from Abdullah bin Abbas that he said, "At-Tawâf حول البيت مثل الصلاة إلا أنكم تتكلمون فيه فمن تكلم فلا يتكلم إلا بخير." Or that Imam at-Tirmidhi narrated that the Prophet ﷺ said, or he narrated from Ibn Abbas that the Prophet ﷺ said, the tawaf around the house, meaning the Kaaba, is like the salat except that you speak during it. So whoever wants to speak, then let him not speak except with something good. So they say here the Prophet ﷺ said that it's like the salat, and the only difference is that you can speak in it. But this hadith from the Prophet ﷺ is weak. So it's authentic from Abdullah bin Abbas, but it's weak from the Prophet ﷺ. And this opinion about it not being from the Prophet ﷺ and being from Ibn Abbas, this was the opinion of Imam al-Nasa'i and al-Bayhaqi and Ibn Salah and Ibn Taymiyyah and others. So they say that it's not from the Prophet ﷺ, but it's from Ibn Abbas. And if it's from Ibn Abbas, then we go back to, if a Sahabi says something, can it make something obligatory or not? No. Because what are we responsible to follow? The wahi, right? So obviously the statements of a Sahabi, they're not wahi. They also say that the hadith from Aisha radiallahu anha, that she said, أول ما بدأ به وإن أول شيء بدأ به رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم حين قدم مكة أنه توضأ فطاف بالبيت. Or that Aisha radiallahu anha said that when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the first thing that he did when he came to Mecca was he performed wudu and then he made the tawaf around the Kaaba. And this hadith is authentic. It's narrated by Bukhari and Muslim. So what they say is that, where do we get our ahkam of the Hajj from? From the Prophet ﷺ. And he said this, لِتَأْخُذُوا عَنِّي مَنَاسِكَكُمْ, or make sure, or you must take from me your ritual acts, so from the Hajj. So if the Prophet ﷺ went and the first thing he did was perform wudu, then this shows that we should do the same thing. What's the problem with that argument though?
If it's obligatory or sunnah?
It's obligatory or not, yeah. So we're not disputing we should do that, like as far as that this is what the Prophet ﷺ did and it's better to do, so no one's disputing that. The thing is though, if the Prophet ﷺ just did something in Hajj, does that make every single thing that he did in Hajj is obligatory to do? Or do we say the things that he did that were obligatory, we have to do them because they're obligatory, and the things that he did that were mustahab, we have to do them because they're mustahab? This is what we say, because how could it be something the Prophet ﷺ did because it's recommended, so he did it because it's mustahab, but now because he did something mustahab, we have to do it now, it's obligatory on us. Does that make sense? So obviously that can't be. It can't be that the one who's doing it even, to show us, it was mustahab for him, but now it's obligatory for us because he did it. It can't be like that. So this is some of the arguments for this opinion. And then they mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, ثُمَّ لْيَقْضُوا تَفَثَهُمْ وَلْيُوفُوا نُذُورَهُمْ وَلْيَطَّوَّفُوا بِالْبَيْتِ الْعَتِيقِ. Or that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commanded the tawaf, and this is how the Prophet ﷺ did it, so we have to do it exactly like he did it. They also mention that, and as we talked about this before, that the person who's upon Janâbah, and so I'll ask you, and because we talked about it, what's the ruling on someone upon Janâbah entering the masjid? Anyone remember? We said 3 opinions we mentioned. So one, the majority say you can't enter even. The Hanâbilah say you can enter if you make wudu. The stronger opinion is if you're upon Janâbah, you can enter whether, it doesn't matter, because there's nothing to say you can't enter the masjid if you're upon Janâbah. Because, obviously you can't pray, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا لَا تَقْرَبُوا الصَّلَاةَ وَأَنْتُمْ سُكَارَى حَتَّى تَعْلَمُوا مَا تَقُولُونَ وَلَا جُنُبًا إِلَّا عَابِرِ سَبِيلٍ حَتَّى تَغْتَسِلُوا. Or that, don't approach the salat. He didn't say don't approach the masjid, don't approach the salat. And in the hadith that many people quote, that the Prophet ﷺ, it's supposed that he said, إِنِّي لَا أُحِلُّ الْمَسْجِدِ لِحَائِضٍ وَلَا جُنُبٍ, or I don't permit the masjid for anyone who's on menstruation or janaba, it's a weak hadith. There's ijma' that it's weak. It's not from the Prophet ﷺ. So there's nothing to prevent the person entering the masjid when he's upon janaba. So we can't use that to say, because someone will say, how can you perform tawaf? Where do you do the tawaf? Do you do it in your home? Where do you do it? The masjid, the best masjid. If you can't enter the masjid, how can you perform tawaf? This is what they argue. But if we say that, and you can go back to those notes, if we say you can enter the masjid, then that argument is no longer an argument. So, because now they say, well, you can't enter the masjid, and we say, no, you can enter the masjid. There's nothing to say no. So now you need something to show you just can't perform tawaf. Now, so you need something else. They say that, what's the ruling on a woman who's upon menstruation performing tawaf?
Wouldn't it be the same for a man if he was on janaba?
No.
No?
No.
Well, I think it's only like she can do it only if she really have to, like when Aisha radiallahu anha, when they had to leave and she was on janaba, but that was just tawaf wada, so they just had to leave. But if it's tawaf ifada and she has to leave, then it's okay for her to go and do it, even if she's on janaba.
If they're going to leave, right?
Yeah,
right.
When they don't have any time. Like,
So if there's no reason for them to leave, can they do it?
No.
Just they decide, I want to do it because I'm on. She's on.
I've heard it's not recommended, but I'm not really sure.
So Allah alam, or no, it's there's a ijma' that it's haram. She can't do the tawaf. There's no dispute. And the hadith for that is the one from Aisha radiallahu anha, that the Prophet ﷺ said, "Isna'i if'ali kull ma yaf'aluhu al-hajj ghayra an la tutufi bil bayt hatta tatahuri." Or do everything that the pilgrim or the hajj does, except that you don't perform the tawaf around the house, around the Kaaba. And then there's ijma' on the topic as well. So it's haram, by consensus.
Except the tawaf al-wada, right?
Even because the problem is because some tawaf has to be performed in order for you to exit ihram.
Yeah.
So the problem is, let's say a woman the night before enters her menstruation. And so she's going to be in the menstruation for the duration of the hajj. And let's say they're leaving after the 3 days of Mina. Like their whole, like the whole Hamla or her whole family, they're all leaving the country. So now she's going to be in menstruation until the whole family, she can't. So either what we say, and Ibn Taymiyyah talked about this and some other ulama, either we say that she has to stay in ihram forever. And could that be something that the Sharia obligates for the rest of her life, this woman has to be in ihram? Obviously not. So the only other option is that we say that she's out of ihram with nothing. Like we just be, like she can just exit ihram without performing tawaf. Or we say, even though she's upon her menstruation, because of this situation, it would be an exception to the rule in order so that she can exit ihram. And Allahu Alam, that's the strongest way, because something has to be done for her to exit ihram.
But is her hajj is not completed? She doesn't do tawaf ifada.
Inshallah, because Allahu Alam, that in that situation she wouldn't have to, because it's tawaf al-wada' is not.
Not ifada, not wada'.
She could join him in
So yeah, like that's a different situation. But the point is, if she has to do them and she's in menstruation and she can't wait until the time is done for her families, then she has to do them somehow. So she has to do them even though she's upon.
So she can't do them upon janaba.
Upon hayd. In that situation only.
Okay.
Yeah. So what they say is that if the woman can't perform tawaf when she's upon janaba or upon hayd, when a woman finishes her menstruation, what does she have to do? Ghusl. When someone wants to leave janaba, what do they have to do? So they say it's the same thing. You can't pray for both. You have to perform ghusl for both to finish it. So they say, if this is the case for the hayd, it's the same for janaba. So they make a qiyas between the two. What's some problems with making this qiyas, or this analogy? Are they the same in everything, or are janaba and hayd the same in everything?
No.
No. If, let's say for example, a woman is fasting, and in the middle of the day she gets her menstruation. What's the ruling on that day?
Fasting is broken.
Fasting's broken. If a man goes to sleep in the middle of the day, and he falls into janaba while he's sleeping, what's the ruling on the fast?
His fasting is okay.
Is okay. So that's one difference. A woman, the fajr starts, and she's still on her menstruation, and then Fajr starts and then she finishes her menstruation. What does she do for that day?
She doesn't fast.
She doesn't fast. A man or a woman, they're upon janaba, and then Fajr starts. What's the ruling on their fast?
It's accepted.
It's accepted. So that's another difference. So that's another difference. A person is upon janaba and they want to go out of janaba. They want to go pray. Can they do it anytime they want, or do they have to wait?
No, they can do it anytime.
Anytime they want. A woman on menstruation, can she just make it stop and then go?
No.
No, they have to wait. So that's another difference. Janaba, what's the asl or the default? How does it start? Intentionally or unintentionally?
Both.
Both. Menstruation, what's the asl or the default? Unintentional. Maybe there's some medical ways, but the default is that it starts without intention. So all of these differences show us that we can't say janaba is the same as hayd. It's completely different. Yes, there's some things that are the same. You have to perform ghusl. But other than that, we can't say, well, because of this is the same. There's too many differences to make that qiyas if we accept it to begin with. So this is another thing. And inshallah we'll stop there, because really I want to have to rush this topic, because I think it's very important and it has many other implications for other topics. So inshallah, Thursday after Salat al-Isha again, we'll finish the arguments for the opinion that says you can't perform Tawâf upon janaba, and then we'll get into the arguments of the ones who say that you can. So inshallah we'll stop there, and then inshallah if there's any questions we can take those. Allahu a'lam.